Okay, here we are, Kinesiology 230, Chapter 19. We are in presentation number 2 and talking about successful weight management programs for obesity. Uh, I've already alluded to this a little bit, but you talk about diet modification, weight loss guidelines, physical activity, lifestyle change, support for obese clients, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, there's different things that go into programming, and we're going to kind of rip through these rather quickly. Uh, as I mentioned before, you have 3,500 calories are in a pound of body fat, and to a certain degree, it doesn't matter how you run that deficit. If it is 500 calories per day of exercise, or if it's 500 calories a day of cutting caloric intake, 500 times 7 becomes 3,500 calories over the course of a week. And so you end up having, if you want, in terms of math, to lose 1 pound per week, your net is 3,500 calories. So it could be you cut 250 calories out of a diet and 250 calories are attributed to exercise. That's 500 calories. That's a way to do it. Or you can do the 500, 500. Different variations for each. So this moderate reduction in calories is the recommended way to do it. So you have this nice, slow, progressive weight loss. Now, I can tell you when I was working with the medical group, these folks were, like I said, about 500-pound big body people. And these folks, when they came into the program itself, it was very aggressive. And it was a matter of losing like 10 pounds in 1 week, 8 pounds another week, maybe 5 pounds the next week, 8 pounds the week after that. But it was through a very hands-on approach that was caloric restriction as well as activity. So these folks, well, they had the extra weight to burn on the front end, and on the front end, it was all about the weight and how many pounds we lost during the week. Now, eventually, that flattens out, and every pound has a greater percentage of body weight. But at first, it's all about the poundage, 100%. So they reiterate this again in terms of guidelines. The literature indicates that a reduction of only 3 to 5% of body weight is sufficient to achieve a reduction in health risk. We saw that in the last presentation. And then they get into here. They talk about reducing body weight by 7 to 10% over 6 months is an appropriate initial goal. At a time, new goals can be set. Now, I will say this. You have some individuals who might come in with some dysmorphia and they think that they are obese. They think they need to lose a bunch of weight. And 7 to 10 pounds might be just the appropriate amount for them. But I've met those individuals with some rarity in my profession, but I've met them. And you have to kind of re-guide them and direct them that, look, if you lose anything beyond the 10% like you're talking about here, it's going to be too much, too fast, too soon. So you have to just be able to have those conversations with your client. With physical activity, if they're talking about 150 calories per day, that's going to be about, give or take, about 1,000 calories per week. And that ends up being a caloric deficit like we were talking about earlier. It could be through diet and nutrition. It could be through actually working out. But moderate levels of physical activity for at least 30 minutes most days of the week are recommended for clients who are overweight or obese and who are beginning an exercise program. And I will tell you that the term moderate can be replaced very much after a month or so, much like you would with any other client. Your clients who are obese or overweight, once you've established a workout routine, they get comfortable with actually working out and some of the aches and pains that are associated with working out, and they've had some exposure to content, you can absolutely push a more aggressive agenda. But you have to start off at the beginner stage, and it might be just one set, and it might be just moving a little bit, it might be walking on a track, but eventually you can ramp this up. But what they're looking for later on somewhere else is moderate levels of physical activity for at least 30 minutes most days of the week are recommended. So what they're getting at is to be consistent in those workouts. Now, the ACSM recommends a minimum of 150 to 300 minutes per week of moderate intensity. This is 40 to 59%. You may recall a chart that we had with different activities. Or 75 minutes of vigorous, so you can take a choice. Now, I will tell you that having worked with this population, you can definitely mix and match this. It doesn't have to be vigorous all the time. It doesn't have to be long, slow distance or moderate all the time. So you can play around with the intensities, and I would advise that just for sake of program design and kind of to mix things up. So you'll have clients, though, and they note here, where you may have to go ahead and go to 60 to 90 minutes per day of moderate to vigorous intensity It just depends. It depends upon the person. So let's take a look at this. Now I know this was seen something very similar was seen in another slide, but they list like kind of common chores. Washing or waxing a car, it's going to be less vigorous. Stair climbing, going to be more vigorous. Running, most vigorous. Playing volleyball, less vigorous. So, you know, you can kind of put this on a continuum and get an idea of what is vigorous and what is not vigorous. And they break this out down here that some of the intensities or some of the activities are performed at varying intensities. So, you know, it could be a case where you do a higher intensity walk and that's going to be a shorter distance. It won't be 1.75 miles, perhaps it's 1.25 miles. Or you're bicycling and you might bicycle at a faster pace. And so as a result, you'll go further, but that'll put you at a higher intensity. So you can play around with those. Lifestyle change to support for obesity and self-monitoring of lifestyle. So lifestyle change, you know, there's different strategies to do this. There's different methods to do this. You hear like Seattle Sutton is one, is a great example of how they have like ways to change lifestyle in terms of eating and how one looks at food. With clients, they'll oftentimes have, and we'll talk about stimulus control and triggering. But folks who come to you who are obese, they have these well-established behaviors, and many times you have to find ways to walk them through a process that to make physiological change, you have to make behavioral change. And the behavioral change sometimes is limited by not making psychological emotional change. So your people have to learn that there's a direct relation between psychological emotional change and physiological change. And the key that is in the between is behavioral. And so your clients just need to understand that one begets the other, which begets the other. Self-monitoring. You know, you'll have clients who will note what they eat every day. They actually journal everything. And to a certain degree, that's great, but a certain degree, it kind of makes food for some people almost punitive, and the process of food to be like punishment in terms of they're not enjoying food anymore. It's becoming this labor-intensive process of recording everything. But that is a process, and self-monitoring is definitely part of it to help record, you know, what types of food and the caloric intake to get a better idea of what people are putting in their bodies. Rewards for accomplishments, and we'll kind of rip through this real quick. Rewards can be used to encourage certain goal achievement, whether it's loss of weight, exercise adherence, it could be anything. And it's just ways to kind of find ways to reward your people for doing something good. And it could be something as simple as just they've lost 10% of their body weight, or they've had 5 days of consistent workouts, or in the month they've had 20 workouts within a month, however they decide to do it. You know, those are real simple things that you can do. Goal setting for weight loss, we talked about this. You know, they may have a goal of losing 20 pounds over 6 months, and you break it down into 3 to 4 pounds per month. That really becomes a very doable process, and it's a process that has built-in benchmarks each month, and it enables your client to be able to have a celebration, if you will, or an appreciation of those goals from month to month to month. Now, you know, if they achieve goals along the way, but they don't achieve the actual goal of 20 pounds, it no longer is an all or nothing proposition. They've actually had the ability to celebrate some small victories along the way. And instead of 6 months, perhaps it becomes 7 months, or it gives you the opportunity to revisit the actual amount that the person wants to lose. So the goal that you have is part of it. You know, weight loss is definitely part of it. The behavioral change is going to be tied to the actual weight loss itself. And to a certain degree, the weight loss is very objective. You either lose 20 pounds or you don't. But you can also try to reward for behavior change. You can try to reward in terms of qualitative goals, how they're feeling, how their clothes are fitting, which in some regard is almost quantitative. They can get into a pair of pants they haven't worn for a while, you know, things like that. But the actual process-oriented goal would be kind of framed around the workouts that they've completed, how many times per week, how many metabolic equivalent points have they earned, you know, ways that you can actually give small rewards and recognize small victories throughout a much bigger process, as opposed to focusing on the end number of 20 pounds weight loss. Stimulus control, you kind of, if you look at this in terms of identifying triggers that cause undesired eating patterns. This happened, this triggered me, I'm going to eat a whole bag of potato chips. This happened, this triggered me, I'm going to eat a whole pint of Haagen-Dazs ice cream, whatever it may be. And these can be environmental trigger. And what happens is this, something within the context of that person's life, whatever their lexicon is, something happens. Whether it's a person frustrates them on the elevator, their boss causes a problem, they have something that happens with their spouse. It could be any number of different things, but it is a triggering event that sets off an undesirable behavior that includes unwanted eating patterns. They may eat junk food, despite not being hungry. They go to a movie like they note here and they're eating popcorn and soda, but they just had dinner. Or because they're at a buffet, they can keep going up and eat more food. Or they are in the process of studying for finals and they have just this habitual crunching of potato chips that helps them while they're working on studying. There's so many different ways that this happens, but you have to start to recognize those triggers and then be able to try to limit your exposure to those triggers for one, but also recognize those triggers and then find a way to self-regulate and self-monitor first, then self-regulate to be able to not let those triggers trigger you into eating more food. Food consumption behavior changes. I talk about this with clients often on the front end. I'm like, well, if you're eating McDonald's 3 times a day, you have a choice. You're either going to eat less McDonald's and incorporate in more or better foodstuffs, or fast food. You're going to get away from fast food, or you can just eat the same amount of calories, but it's going to be good foodstuffs. I try to guide my people not to take on both of those two-headed monsters at the same time. It's either going to be how much you eat or what you're eating, right? And with the process, the consumption itself matters, right? Because for some of your clients, they will feel as though they're deprived and it's really taken away from their ability to enjoy food because they have a psychological and emotional attachment to food. Now, it's a matter of how much you eat or what you eat, but it's also the tempo at which you eat. And they note this, and I think this has its place, where eating too fast doesn't allow the body time to identify the being satiated, being full. And that takes several minutes to actually reach the brain to be able to shut off the actual hunger response. So a couple things that can happen here is you do things like use smaller plates to make your portion size look bigger. You also maybe don't go to a buffet in the first place. But to a certain degree, you try to find ways to minimize triggers. You find ways to change food consumption behaviors, whether it's what you're eating, how much you're eating, or how fast you're eating. And you try to find these ways to incorporate these behavioral changes in, because again, if you want to make a physiological change, you have to make a behavioral change. But I'll say it again, many of the behaviors, especially those that are associated with eating and eating disorders, are rooted in psychological and emotional, many times psychological and emotional trauma, to be quite honest. All right, I'm breaking off. I'm going to go to the next presentation.